Confined space entry. This video, the PowerPoint for it, is courtesy of Ozarks Technical Community College. It's under a grant by the Center of Workforce Development to provide this for training. Here we go, course objectives. As a result of this training, you'll be able to know what a confined space is, identify and understand permit required confined spaces, identify and understand non-permit confined spaces, understands the hazards associated with confined spaces, understand the roles associated with confined space entry, have an awareness, understanding of emergency rescue, have an awareness, understanding of the types of PPE, personal protective equipment, that may be required for entry into confined spaces. In the water and wastewater, we don't have too many permit required confined spaces. Usually the dilemma is we're typically not under OSHA regulations. However, if you ever have an issue, you will become under them because OSHA will investigate. As a result of this training, you'll be able to understand the roles and responsibilities of the attendant, the entrant, the supervisor. Understand the process for testing the atmosphere in a confined space. Learn how to isolate, ventilate, and evaluate the space in preparation for entry. Understand the 3 types of rescue techniques. You have the right to a safe workplace. The Occupational Safety and Health Act 1970 was passed to prevent workers from being killed or seriously harmed at work. The law requires employers to provide their employees with working conditions that are free of unknown danger. The Act created OSHA, which sets and enforces protected workplace safety and health standards. Also provides information, training, assistance to workers and employees. Workers may file a complaint to have OSHA inspect their workplace if they believe that their employer is not following OSHA standards and there are serious hazards. Workers' right under the OSHA Act. Workers are entitled to working conditions that do not pose a risk of serious harm. To help assure a safe and healthful workplace, OSHA also provides workers a right to receive information and training about hazards, observe testing that's done to find hazards in the workplace and get test results, review records of work-related injuries or illnesses, get copies of their medical records, request OSHA to inspect your workplace, use your rights under the law free from retaliation and discrimination. Confined spaces. OSHA estimates that about 224,000 establishments have permit spaces. 7.2 million production workers are employed at the establishments and about 2.1 million workers enter permit spaces annually. OSHA anticipates that compliance with these regulations will avoid 53 worker deaths and injuries, 4,900 lost workday cases, and about 5,700 non-lost time accidents annually. Are confined spaces dangerous? Simple answer, yes. According to NIOSH publications on confined space regarding workmer deaths in confined spaces, this is old information, 1994. Publication provides a summary of surveillance findings, which 70 investigative case reports from 70 incidents in which 109 workers died. These incidents investigation occurred between December 83 and September 1993. You can follow this link here. You can Google it, either one, but what I want you to notice here is that 70 case reports and 109 workers died. That's the thing to remember. Safety first. Okay, here I'll let you read this. Are confined spaces dangerous? This is kind of a summary of it. Following hazards were noted: atmosphere, flammable, explosive, inert gas asphyxiants, oxygen deficient, solvents, toxic gases, engulfment, falls, electrocution, physical hazards of drowning. Here's an interesting study. According to a report from the Canadian Centre for Occupational Health and Safety, many workers are injured and killed each year while working confined spaces. An estimated 60% of the fatalities have been among the would-be rescuers. That's you when your buddy is in a confined space and become asphyxiated to something and you jump down in there to save him, you're going to lose your life too. Confined spaces are dangerous because they may contain hazards in the air, they can trap you, they always contain slip and fall hazards, and there may be hazards you might not be able to see. Training. The employer shall provide training so that all employees whose work is regulated by this section acquire the understanding, knowledge, and skills necessary for the safe performance of their duties assigned under this section. Training shall be provided to each effective employee. Before the employee is first assigned duties under this section, before there is a change in assigned duties, whenever there is a change in permit space operations, it presents a hazard about which the employee has not previously been trained. Whenever the employer has reason to believe that there are deviations in the permit space procedures. What is a confined space? A space that is large enough so they configure that an employee can enter bodily and perform work, has limited or restricted means of entry or exit, and is not designed for continuous human occupancy. That's something to remember. It's not designed for continuous human occupancy. Remember, if you break the plane of a confined space, you have entered the confined space. So when you break entry, you have entered that confined space. Permit required confined space. Permit required confined space is confined space that has one or more of the following characteristics. Contains or has potential to contain a hazardous atmosphere. Material has potential for engulfing an entrant. Has an internal configuration such that an entrant could be trapped or asphyxiated. Contains any other serious safety or hazard. Examples of permit confined spaces. Permit required confined spaces. Manholes going into sewers, grain silos, trenches. We see this in manholes sometimes, and a manhole will almost always contain all four of these here. Even the material for engulfing an entrant. If you got the sewer line plugged and that plug comes out, you can get engulfed. And so, you know, and there's all kinds of hazardous atmosphere down in a manhole. So a manhole is what you'll typically be entering. Non-permit confined space, such as in this picture here. This would be like a water tower, water tank. Confined spaces do not contain or have potential to contain any hazard capable of causing death or serious physical harm. Examples of non-permit required confined space: a drop ceiling or motor control cabinet. Always remember when you're entering a water tower or water tank, through the bottom hatch, have the top hatch open. Here's various examples of confined spaces, many which you will not be involved in, but you got tanks, manholes, sewers, could be tunnels, pipes, ductworks, pipes are big enough, pits, trenches. Potential hazards in confined spaces. This is what you need to know and need to be checking with your meter. Asphyxiating oxygen deficiency. Less than 19.5% or greater than 23.5% oxygen concentration. CO2 is toxic in higher concentrations. 1%, 10,000 parts per million will make some people feel drowsy. Concentrations of 7% to 10% cause dizziness, headache, visual and hearing dysfunction, and unconsciousness within a few minutes to an hour. Feel drowsy, get out. Toxic materials can be such as carbon monoxide, hydrogen sulfide. Welding fumes are corrosive. Mechanical hazards, mixers, crushers. Engulfment is soil around an excavation, grainer and silo, powdered material in a bin. You'll deal mostly with engulfment with soil around an excavation. We'll have several videos on trench safety, which you might have already done. Potential hazards in confined spaces: electricity, flammable combustibles, methane, hydrogen, acetylene, propane, and gas fumes. Oxygen deficiency. Oxygen should be removed from the air in a confined space. Material in the space could displace the oxygen. Rusting could create a chemical reaction that uses up the oxygen. The space could be purged with a gas to prevent explosion. Entry is the act by which a person intentionally passes through the opening into a confined space. Any part of the body passing through the opening is considered entry. Immediately dangerous to life or health. IDLH. Any condition which poses an immediate threat to the health or life of an entrant or would cause irreversible adverse health effects or would interfere with an individual's ability to escape unaided from a permit space. Entrant. This is the employee who will physically enter the confined space to do the work. Attendant is the employee who remains outside the confined space, monitors the entrant, guards the space against authorized entry, warns the entrant of any unusual conditions that they see, summons a rescue if personal help is needed. Entry supervisor. The employee responsible for coordinating entry into the confined space. Supervisor doesn't necessarily mean management. It can just be anyone acting as a supervisor at that time, at that site. Two options for entering confined spaces: permit required or non-permit. For this training, we'll focus on the permit required entry because it is the most hazardous. In a permit required for a space, your procedure should be to isolate the space, ventilate the space, complete your permit, test the atmosphere, and enter the space. Different ways to isolate the space from hazards is lockout, tag out, such as valves, electrical sources, any part that's rotating or can move, anything that has residue that might affect you, get it out of there before you start your work. Depressurize, vent, and drain. To isolate the space, use mechanical ventilation, which is fans or air horns. The acceptable practice is 20 complete air changes per hour or one every 3 minutes for a confined space. Ventilation will also depend on the type of material that's being vented from the space. Better safe than sorry. Make sure air supply is not contaminated. Make sure that your blower is not sitting up on top, sucking it right back in. If you could have an air hole seepage around somewhere around the top that could be letting that suck right back down into your blower and blowing it back out again, just be cycling the same air. Make sure that's not happening. Complete the entry form. Must be correctly and completely filled out prior to entry. For it to be valid, it must be activated by the supervisor on site or that set it up. Entry permit shall identify the permit space to be entered, the purpose of the entry, the date, and the authorization, the duration of the entry. More about complete entry permit form. The authorized entrance within the permit space. I'll let you read that. Personnel by name currently serving as attendants. More of the entry permit form. The individual by name is serving as entry supervisor. The hazards of permit space to be entered. Any hazard that you see it could be. Measures used to isolate the permit space and to eliminate the control space hazards before entry. You need to list all of the things that you think that it might need to be eliminated. Entry conditions. Initial periodic tests. Document those tests. Rescue emergency services can be summoned and the means of summoning these purposes. You need to have the fire department, if that's who your responders are, know that you're entering a confined space so they can be available in a moment's notice. Communication procedures used by authorized entrants and attendants to maintain contact during entry. You must have contact back and forth. If you're the entrant and the attendant, you have to have some means to communicate, especially if you're out of sight. You need to list the equipment, your PPE equipment, your testing equipment, communications, alarm, rescue equipment to be provided. Anything else that you see as necessary, you need to list it on the permit. Cover yourself. When work is completed, a permit form should be returned to the Safety Department or the department responsible for maintaining the completed or enclosed permits. Canceled permits when you're finished must be kept on file for at least 1 year. Test the atmosphere, oxygen. We mentioned it earlier. It got to be between 9.5 and 23.5. Anything less or anything more is unacceptable. Get your tail out. Checks for combustibles. Less than 10% of the lower explosive limit. Check for toxic gases or any other hazardous materials as determined by the use of the space. Remember, all confined space atmospheres must be tested for oxygen, flammability agents, and other toxic agents. You don't know what is in that confined space until you step in it. Therefore, test it first, or you'll be a statistic. Testing the atmosphere. Continually test it. That's the only way that you know if your air ventilation is working. If a hazardous atmosphere is detected during your entry, leave it immediately. Space should be evaluated to determine how the hazardous atmosphere developed. And then measures must be implemented to protect you from the hazardous atmosphere before any entry again takes place. The employer shall verify that the space is safe for entry and that the pre-entry measures required by paragraph have been taken through a written certification that contains the date, the location of space, the signature of the person who provided the certification. Certification shall be made before entry and shall be made available to each employee entering the space or to that employee's authorized representative. If you don't think it's safe, don't enter it. If your employer tells you that it's safe, let them enter it. Anytime a limit on a permit is exceeded, no matter what the reason, if all personnel shall exit the space, and no other shall enter until atmospheric conditions are returned to safe levels. There are no exceptions to this rule. If your time is up, your time is up. Just start again with a new permit and all your tests before you go on. Atmosphere testing must be performed. Prior to every entry, whenever the space is vacant, after a 10-minute ventilation period if ventilation is necessary, at least hourly for permit required confined spaces. Good practice to retest atmosphere after breaks or having been out of the confined space for a period of time, more frequently if conditions or suspicions warrant. It's kind of contradictory here. It says we're good practice to retest after breaks or having been out of the confined space. Permit says prior to every entry when the space is vacant. So anytime you go out of that space, retest. Always test the air at various levels to be sure that the entire space is safe. Good air at the opening does not mean good air at the other end. This is a good example. Most of your gases will be heavy and will sink to the bottom. You'll think it's good, but it's not. Remember, evaluate the space. Determine that the space meets all the conditions set forth in a non-permit justification. Conduct atmospheric testing, and your evaluation must be signed and certified by your supervisor's signature. Determine the confined space does not have a hazardous atmosphere, contain a material with the potential for engulfment, and to make sure that there's room for you to work. Even though it's a confined space, you have to have room to work. Enter the space and proceed with work. An attendant will be posted near the entrance for the duration of the work. He should be in constant communication with all entries while the job is in progress. The authorized entrance within the permit space by name and other means, which we've discussed earlier. So the attendant has to know who all's in there and keep up with it. The attendant must maintain the permit sign-in log for the duration of the work. For you to go in there, you have to sign in the log. He has to keep that is done. When the job is done, remove all tools, debris, and personal items from the space, close the space, cancel a permit, review the job with the employer, make more ready for the next time. Break. Contractor confined space entry. This is like if you hire a contractor to do something. If you hire a contractor, you're not out of liability because it's your duty to inform them of the hazards that space could contain. Then contractors must coordinate their own established confined space entry procedures and then use their permit forms. Contractors must coordinate the use of air monitors with the host site. Sometimes you have to provide the air monitor. Contractors must review entry after completion of the job. Remember, coordination between the contractor and the host site is critical for the safety of all involved. You don't want to be sued by your contractor's family if something happens to them if you haven't provided all the details that they need. Attendant responsibilities. If you're the attendant, you must ensure the safety of the others inside, and you may not abandon your post for any reason unless you're relieved by another qualified attendant. I don't personally believe that any attendant should be someone that has not been an entrant in some point in the past to know what it's like down inside of a confined space. Attendant responsibility is to monitor atmospheric conditions in the space prior to and during entry, control access, make sure no one is there, summon emergency assistance as needed, assess hazards in and around the space and take action if something happens, keep records such as air test results, who enters and exits, etc. Entrant responsibilities. If you're the entrant, you need to assure that the space has been adequately ventilated, isolated, emptied, or otherwise made safe for entry. To exit a space without question upon word of the attendant, no matter what the reason. If the attendant says come out, do it immediately. No question, no hesitation, no let me finish this right now, just get out. They're your line to safety. To follow all safety rules and procedures that apply to the job. And you need to be familiar with the work to be performed and procedures that apply to the job. If you're down in there and don't know what the job you're supposed to perform, you should be trained on how to do that job before you enter that space. To use appropriate PPE when necessary. It's your responsibility to make sure you have the right professional, personal equipment, and it's your employer's responsibility to make sure that you have the correct PPE also. Supervisor responsibility. To ensure adequate protection is provided to entrants by verifying adequate lockout, tagout, and all hazards are isolated, controlled, or eliminated. To support the attendant's authority in controlling access to a confined space. To verify that all personnel have exited prior to closing the space. That's what your entry and exit log is for. To ensure that all personnel involved are aware of the hazards associated with the space. To ensure that rescue services are available prior to entry. Emergency rescues, which you hope never has to happen. Permitted confined space, your emergency rescue teams must be available while authorized entrants are in the confined space. Deaths often occur during rescue. Employees attempt to rescue an entrant without the proper training and then get caught themselves in the confined space. Those numbers that we talked about at the beginning of this video are sad because so many employees jump in to help someone else because the proper procedures have not been carried out and they themselves die. Rescue techniques. There are 3 types of rescue techniques: a non-entry, entry by others, and entry by trained employees from the company. Lifelines are a good thing. Everyone should have a lifeline when they go in. Entry by others would be like the fire and rescue and trained employees from the company. Typically the large companies that have this constantly have their own trained rescue team that are available anytime there's an emergency. Non-entry, a good picture here exactly of a non-entry. Like on a manhole, have your safety line hooked up where they can crank you out of there in a heartbeat. Entry by others, like we said, this is typically your fire and rescue. One thing to remember about if you rely on entry by others, and even if you do it yourself, is the local fire department and rescue squads need to be aware of all of your confined spaces and where they are, what their potential hazards are, so they know how to respond in any emergency. Not going to do anybody any good if the fire and rescue isn't aware of what's inside and the potential hazard. It just takes longer when they respond if they're not well aware of the situation. If you got confined space, you need to contact your fire and rescue and let them be aware. Let them train at it. That'd be the ideal thing to do. Well, here we go. We just talked about it. The fire department or rescue team would need to be familiar with your space, the equipment needed, and anything that is required for the potential rescue. Entry by trained employees from the company. If your system has a large staff, you may have a trained rescue team. One thing, if you got a trained rescue team, you must make sure that there's plenty of equipment for that rescue team to work, and the team must practice in all types of spaces which a rescue might be required. If a rescue is required, rescue service must close off the area, get authorized entrance out of the space, and perform first aid when needed. Best to use a retrieval system such as A-frame here, tripod. Never enter the space without proper training unless it is necessary. Authorized entrance should wear a harness connected to the retrieval line. Absolutely. Retrieval equipment must be in place before employees enter the permit space. So your tripod needs to be set up before anybody even goes in, even if it's not in use. But it should be in use because usually that's the only way you can get down in there. PPE, personal protective equipment. One of the most important components of a PPE in a confined space is a respirator. Note, you'll need a physician's approval or clearance to wear a respirator. It's important to fit test a respirator. Beards, sometimes mustaches, do not work good with a respirator, and a physician's approval is if the physician needs to make sure that you get enough air, enough oxygen yourself. If you're a person with asthma or something similar to that, you don't need to wear a respirator. You don't need to be doing a confined space. Other PPE could be a safety harness, rope, and cables for retrieval. Hearing protection depending on type of work you're confined into space. Safety harness, ropes, and cables, always. Here's a list of other personal protective equipment. Okay, the next step. When you get back from your site, be sure to review and further train on. Each time that you do a confined space entry, you learn from it. And therefore, it needs to be reviewed each time that you perform a confined space entry. The only way you can really get comfortable at it is practice and experience. Be safe. The only one that can protect you is you. Here are other things to consider. Things to remember. The employers to mark confined space in a permit required. They must identify the hazardous space post permit before allowing employees to enter. The employer posts the permits near the entrance of each confined space displaying necessary information. The entrance should remember safety training and read the permit before entering the space. Absolutely. You need to know what's included in the hazard before you enter the space. And then you can pick your proper PPE and be alert to potential hazards. Leave the space if there's a danger or hear an excavation alarm or if the attendant summons you. The attendants must understand the dangers in around a confined space, as well as stay in contact with the authorized entrant and be prepared to order evacuation and call the rescue team. The entry supervisor needs to ensure the confined space operates conform to the permit. They should remove unauthorized personnel from the area, keep them from entering the space. The entry supervisor terminates and cancels the permit at the right time. Remember, the supervisor is who cancels a permit and writes a permit. The more people that you have involved, the more safe it's going to be, because if you just look yourself, you don't have your supervisor look, you don't have the entrant looking, everybody needs to decide what all it entails. The more eyes, the more easy hazards can be identified. Emergency rescues should be only made by trained personnel or rescue service. Report any concerns you may have regarding confined spaces. Thank you for watching.